So, Bill, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. You joined NCCN right after Bruce Ross. So let's do the timeline.
Yeah, so I joined NCCN. Actually, I remember it was Martin Luther King Day, 1997. I had, been at Aetna for just around 6 years, specifically running a number of areas, most conspicuously or importantly, the whole coverage area, both on the medical side and also the pharmacy side. So, got recruited down to NCCN, which was interesting. NCCN actually came in to see me in August of 1996. This is before I really even knew what NCCN was. Actually, Bob Young came up with an outside consultant, and Sarah Paquel, who was at the time, the COO of NCCN. She had been there about a year. Bruce Ross hired her.
Mm-hmm. So basically, when I heard from Bruce Ross that you were going to be his designated or handpicked or chosen successor, and by then I had probably known you for maybe at least 5 or 6 or 7 years, maybe longer.
Yeah.
I think I probably knew you before Aetna. So let's talk maybe a bit of a prehistory. Let's establish that because I think that leads into everything.
Well, I mean, it was interesting because, quite frankly, Aetna was undergoing changes. They had purchased U.S. Healthcare, a small 3-state HMO plan, and they actually wanted Aetna wanted this group to take all of Aetna over, not just the huge health plan that we had. So things were in turmoil there, and so I was thinking at the time of actually going into consulting, starting my own consulting company for a variety of reasons. I was, as people said, like, you're the only one who has the experience you have in terms of kind of your background in actually deciding coverage about everything from a drug to a artificial heart. So I was thinking about that, and I had an offer to go in with a company, but for me, there wasn't equity. And so I was thinking about going on my own. And then this NCCN, as I say, they met with me in August, and it was about November of that year, that 1996, that a headhunter, maybe in October, headhunter called me and said, "Would you be interested in this NCCN?" And I kind of said, "Well, yeah, I'll look into it." And so I didn't actually expect it would happen, but it did.
Mm-hmm. But you were one of the pioneers of technology assessment.
Yeah.
Care to the point where when Bruce told me they were hiring you, I said, yeah, whom else are you going to hire? I mean, this guy knows what he's doing. Can we talk a little bit more about your bone marrow transplant for breast cancer?
Yeah, I mean, that was just an intriguing issue. Actually, I've been started involved in the controversy way back, actually, when I was at the American Medical Association, where, to your point, I set up what was called the Diagnostic and Therapeutic Technology Assessment Program at AMA, which actually became quite influential, including over payers specifically. And bone marrow transplant was a huge issue even back then. And then when I basically got recruited to Aetna, it was just intriguing because I was at the major thing Aetna was interested in was basically, I'd written a lot about how you manage and how new technologies really evolve specifically into appropriate use in practice. And the one thing they had on their minds at Aetna was this whole bone marrow transplant issue. Because it turns out I went there in, I guess it was June of, let's see, what year was that? Oh, God, 1990. Yeah, June. When did I leave? June of 97. I got to get my time frame now. It's 97. That would put me at NCCN. So I would say 91 or 92. Mm-hmm. And they informed me that actually on the first Monday of my job that Aetna was going to be at 60 minutes having turned down a bone marrow transplant. And it was actually the second time that this story had been run on 60 Minutes, and it was actually run a third time, despite my being on, as I always say, for 90 minutes with 60 Minutes, explaining the whole new process I set up, which was a model that was used across the country, including was written in the law in the state of California. So bone marrow transplant was a huge, as you well know, controversial issue in the 1990s specifically, and we were just right in the middle of it at Aetna.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had Grace Powers Monaco. You suggested to her that she set up a business essentially which
Well,
was,
she set up the business later. So Grace was a wonderful person. So I had known her, and so I know you know her well. And so I called her up and I said, Grace, I got this problem, this issue here. And I think I have an idea of how to fix it or address it. And so I got on the train, went down to Washington. I met with her, and in my book, it talks about how she said after a few minutes, yeah, you've got a big problem there. But, we worked it out, and, a lot of it was her idea in terms of saying, what we did was we basically took every bone marrow transplant case, and we didn't make any judgment, yes or no at Aetna, and we turned them all over to her, and she picked independently. We never said who to pick or not to pick. 3 of the, world's leading docs in the US, many of them turned out to be NCCN docs. And if 1 out of 3 said, if 1 out of 3 said, yes, it's okay, then we covered the transplant. So it was a very effective process that we set up, and extremely fair. You couldn't get more fair, but obviously you were dealing with patients who were like severe life-threatening illness. So anyway, so that's how Grace and I got together. And that was a major issue, which took up a major component of my time at Aetna, but also kind of threw Aetna into the national spotlight.
this was before, well, actually, by the time you got to NCCN, bone marrow transplant for breast cancer was pretty much settled, and NCCN had an idea.
Not quite. It was still, so just, I'm sorry?
Yeah, not quite yet, but
so
yeah, tell me.
It was getting, so anyway, so it was still fulminating out there, but it was probably settling down a little bit, and that was 97. To the point it was, as you know, in 1999, it was when like 6 or 7 US docs went over to South Africa and wanted to see the data on the, I'm blanking on the doc from South Africa's publication. Yeah, and there was no data. He made it all up. So that was the issue. And to NCCN's credit, and Bob Carlson was chair of the breast cancer panel, NCCN, from the provider perspective, had been maintaining and did maintain that for breast cancer, autologous bone marrow transplantation, obviously with high-dose chemotherapy, was investigational. When actually National Blue Cross Blue Shield had decided that it should be covered. So, there was certainly great credit to that breast cancer panel at NCCN for sticking to their guns and basically saying we don't have the data. And the small bit of data that was being used to support bone marrow transplant in breast cancer turned out to be totally false.
That was amazing to see that kind of play out, that insistence on data, which of course NCI was at the time running the trials. It was running the high priority trials.
So it was just interesting because I was involved in that too, because I became quite friendly with Bob Wittes when he ran that Office of Department of Drug something and Evaluation at NCI. So every once in a while, when I was at Aetna, he would call me down, and I'd go down to Washington, and I just tell the folks there what Aetna was doing and what we were thinking specifically. So to your point, the issue was, as he told me, he said, we can't accrue enough patients to do the clinical trials. They had 2 national clinical trials on BMT. High-dose chemotherapy is really the therapy, as you know, in high-dose chemo, BMT, and breast cancer, but they couldn't accrue enough patients because there was so much support for it out there as being standard of care. Patients did not want to be randomized.
What did you see as a potential? Why did you accept the NCCN job? Because you had other options. What was good?
Yeah, I don't know. It was just it was just interesting. Actually, one of the major components, because I was like really going back and forth in terms of starting my consulting career back then. I would say one of the major drivers was a personal one, in the sense that my wife was from Philadelphia, and her father had just died of bladder cancer, and her mother was down there, and it got us down to Philadelphia specifically. So, I say I was going back and forth. I just not the mission, but the strategy of NCCN just was not clear enough. But eventually I just said, look, obviously, who would not want to have the opportunity to work with these great institutions specifically and try and build something.
Well, there was Joe Simone, there was Bob Young,
Yeah,
there was Bruce
yeah. I
Ross.
only met Joe. So the only time I spoke with Joe Simone was, God bless him, he interviewed me in Washington after the executive committee had interviewed me, and it was just an aside. So I went to the Hilton Hotel in Chicago, where the NCCN was having its board meeting, and it's funny. I was walking through the lobby to go to the meeting room where I was going to meet with this executive committee, and there was Alice Gosfield, who I knew. So, hey, what are you doing here? And then blah 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 blah. So, and I walked into the room, and it was like 86 degrees, no exaggeration. And I thought, oh well, I'm done. I'm going to be sweating like a, whatever by the end of this. But God was with me. I just sat there and answered the questions, as I always do, with like, this is what I thought, and so it turns out, I guess they thought I'd be a good person to take over the NCCN, because I think that, well, not only do I think, but I later found out that, institutions were concerned that nothing was happening at NCCN, and they were paying, substantial dues every year. And a couple of the major institutions were threatening and voicing that they might withdraw from NCCN.
Well, the organization was set up for a certain set of goals, and which were, if I remember correctly, I'll probably forget one. One of them was managed care. That was the urgency, the DRGs, excuse me.
No, it was managed care.
Managed care under the Hillary Health Plan.
Well, I think my view, well, it wasn't my view, because I think the issue is so at the time, I remember in 1993, I think it was, there was this headline across the Wall Street Journal: National Cardiovascular Care Network established. I know it generated a lot of interest at Aetna. I was the one that was running specifically the whole organ transplant and bone marrow transplant network. And so I actually was tasked with setting up a National Cardiovascular Care Network. But I think that generated a lot of interest across the NCCN institutions in saying, look, we're the best, institutions, hospitals in the country for cancer treatment and care. We should set up a similar national network. And I think that was one of the main reasons for the formation of the NCCN. And now I'll just add something, then I'll stop. But I think the issue there was, having set up and negotiated. It was interesting at Aetna. I, being on the medical management side, was negotiating like contracts, including rates at big institutions, including MD Anderson. And I think one of the issues that affected, because it didn't work, it was a bad strategy, a bad idea for NCCN to have a national network, because I think a bottom line, if you're looking like at MD Anderson is not going to want Bill McGivney or anybody else from something called NCCN to negotiate what reimbursement they're going to get for their services. So,
right. There's also a possibility of antitrust issues and so forth. So that
that's a good point.
Yeah, so that didn't plan out, and the danger went away as Hillary Health Plan went away too.
Yes.
So that went away. So there are two things. So the urgency is gone. So the second reason was, of course, guidelines. That was live. And the third reason was kind of pie in the sky, being able to show that academic cancer centers provide better value than community care, which is a difficult thing to prove.
Right.
Even true.
It's difficult to prove, and it's kind of also a political issue, because here, maybe not so much end of the 90s, but certainly in the early 2000s, these big academic centers were trying to compete with each other, and we're setting up these networks, in the community. I know, for example, if you look at the Boston membership for NCCN, it's Mass General and the Brigham, and while they were and Dana-Farber. So it's a trifold membership. And if you looked at it, there was this whole big competition between Mass General and Dana-Farber about setting up their own community networks. So they'd be trying to, convince certain community practices to join the Dana-Farber network or the Mass General network, et cetera. So it was, there were always these kind of internal issues, that would stress somewhat, the whole concept of having a united NCCN.
So by the time you arrive,
Yeah.
the biggest threat is kind of gone away, maybe a couple years before. Then the rest is just these two things that are pretty nebulous, and the money comes in from dues only. And,
Right.
and then you come in and you see opportunities that
Well, Rogerwynn, the father of NCCN guidelines, was just a terrific person. I think, he had the understanding, I almost said foresight, and foresight, but he had the understanding that, first of all, if you're a breast cancer doc or a lung cancer doc at an NCCN institution, you know the data, the guidelines, the trial design backward and forward. And so that the audience that needed guidelines from a group like NCCN clearly were the community docs, because the community docs may be treated at that time 8 to 10 types of cancer, and to keep track of all the data as the data was accelerating and advances were accelerating was going to be extremely difficult. The second component was he understood, unlike other organizations, you don't need to have like this glorified, sophisticated, super methodologically oriented process where, for example, you have to do a total organized, systematic literature search. He understood, as I say, that the docs who were sitting in that room knew the literature cold, and they could come in and then they could develop the guidelines and update them as further data proceeded. So he designed the whole process so it was an extremely reasonable, fairly not expeditious, but timely and certainly an efficient process in terms of getting recommendations out to the target audience and in a manner and a format that was clear to the target audience, i.e. the community docs that they needed.
Wait, so who comes up with the plan? I thought it was Bob Young and Rogerwynn.
Well, it was Rogerwynn.
Okay.
I think historically, I wasn't there, but when they were talking about why to form NCCN, you are correct. The second issue was development of guidelines. Guidelines, as you know, was a hot thing because in 1987, Bob Wenberg, up there at Dartmouth, published his articles about the inappropriate, and medically unnecessary procedures going on and how we needed guidelines. And so a lot of groups, for example, the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association had guidelines in 1991, well before the NCCN. But that was a basis, as you said, for starting the NCCN. And as I say, the person they tasked with this is before I got there, was Rogerwynn, who was down at MD Anderson, but who had been recruited from MD Anderson to run community oncology for MD Anderson. He was a community oncologist up there in New Jersey. So as I say, he had the clarity of vision not to make this too complex, and again, put it in a format that directly communicated the information and recommendations to those who needed it most, that is community oncologists.
Is that still used, by the way, his approach to expert-based guidelines as opposed
Yeah,
to...
it's basically the way NCCN does it. There have been, I just remember when I was there, well, why don't you make this, we try to make it a little bit more systematic. Why don't you make it systematic so that it's even more similar across panels? And I just said, you know what, that'll destroy the whole effort. These panels, some do have the different personalities. There might be a greater acceptance, if you will, of abstracts versus publications. But you know what? It basically churned out and updated in an amazing fashion, updated the guidelines so that they were up to date. So if something came out, and when I was there, I would actually walk the halls. For example, a drug or biologic within 2 weeks of approval might be, or usually was, in the NCCN Drugs Biologics Compendium with an NCCN recommendation.
Like just looking back before NCCN, if you got a particular disease, you went out and found the luminary who knew exactly what to do. And that would be in a major cancer center, possibly in Boston,
right,
in New York, possibly in Houston, and a few others. But that's NCCN is something else. It's more like, here it is. This is the treatment you would get from one of the luminaries, and so go next door.
Well, exactly. I mean, it was just interesting because the first guideline was released in 1996. It was the breast cancer guideline. I was not at NCCN yet. But, by the early 2000s, I mean, what was happening is clearly they were becoming the standard of care out there. And what we saw was that the payers started to use them. I remember I would get emails from Aetna asking me or saying, this is our interpretation of the NCCN recommendation here when they were trying to establish a coverage policy. Is this correct? And so I said, we're up to this. And so I would write back. And I knew what they were doing is they were establishing a, what do you call it? Not an excuse, but basically establishing a firmer platform upon which to set coverage policy. Because if somebody questioned them, they could always just point and say, well, NCCN says, but that was important because what that was the start of what I think was the most significant action or event that happened while I was at NCCN, in that payers increasingly use it, even through the establishment of the Drugs Biologics Compendium, but it increasingly used NCCN recommendations to set coverage policy. And what we did is we turned the tables, we being NCCN, 180 degrees, in the sense that as the payers were assuming more authority and telling what the docs to do, in oncology, the NCCN panels were telling what the payers what they should do and what they should cover.
But they were paying you in order to be able to use your guidelines.
The payers? No. I wanted them to use the guidelines. No, we didn't. So that's why the guidelines are available free of charge.
License them to use them. You have to have.
Sorry?
You have to have a license to use them.
Oh, well, I don't know. So the issue was with the payers, we wanted them to use them. So while I was there, it was like, and so while I was there, we were just encouraging them to use them and take the recommendations. I think actually, if you look at that scroll that runs under the NCCN, I don't think there's any major payer. By that I mean Aetna, Cigna, United, who basically pay the NCCN to use the guidelines to establish coverage policy. And that would be on purpose, because otherwise, I mean, what are the NCCN guidelines? Importantly, there are two things. They represent the standard of care, and secondly, they drive coverage policy with payers. So we want the payers to use them, and I wouldn't want any hindrance whatsoever put in the payers' way, because that would basically diminish the influence that the panels and the NCCN had on behalf of patients and docs.
But the money changed. I mean, the dues became a small part of what NCCN.
Exactly.
And that was changed. Where did the rest of the money come from?
Most of the money came from the biopharma industry. They were always interested in having the NCCN recommendations communicated, particularly obviously to other docs, to constituents, and they supported all sorts of educational events. Just two things. So, we did that, and obviously we had and still have the conflict of interest policy, but in terms of transparency and in terms of which docs work with which companies, and setting limits on how much money panel members, for example, can have. But, I think, it's just is interesting in the sense that, big newspapers would ask me, call me up, and, well, what about this? Well, to get down like a discussion about like a cup of, they, provide a cup of coffee to somebody. And go, you got to be kidding me. And I would say about the NCCN guidelines, I would say, look, this is a free market. We have a product. We are explicit about how the guidelines are developed. We're explicit about where NCCN money comes from, all our educational grants and things like that. And we put them on the market. If somebody, and all the payers use them. So if somebody else comes up with a better idea on how to do it, then let them come to the marketplace, and take our place. And then the second component was, I remember being at an NCCN annual meeting, and we were doing one of the Cliff Goodman roundtables. So I was in the audience, and they were talking about this and that, and someone brought up biopharma money and all this for educational. And I had done the previous year, I said to myself, I've had enough of this. So what I did is every time we sent an application for an educational grant to a pharma company, we sent the same grant request to what do you call it? Big managed care companies, United, Aetna, all of them. And as I got up in the audience, it said that day, and we had a perfect record. We submitted 35 grant applications to, the major payers in the United States for educational events, and we had 35 that were declined. So it's like, so what do you want me to do?
That was fascinating. So you come into, I'm going back to your first day.
Yeah.
At that time, there are 3 compendia that are used to determine what gets paid for and what
Right.
doesn't get paid for. And here we're talking about off-label reimbursement or
That's right.
reimbursement of off-label uses. So here are these 3 compendia, and then they start falling by the wayside.
They do.
Go ahead.
And I had worked for one of them, AMA drug evaluations. So I had actually worked on AMA drug evaluations at the AMA. So I was familiar with the compendium process, but they fell to the wayside, interestingly, or began to in the 1990s, just when they were being recognized by legislation and regulation. So it's kind of crazy. But I mean, I was sitting in my office one day, and as the payers started to use the guideline recommendations more, I said, well, we need to facilitate this for payers, as they're mainly interested in drugs and biologics, and as you say, off-label use. What we're going to do is we're going to develop our own compendium and develop a nice, comprehensive, logical listing of indications and other information that quickly the payers can look up, and they can make coverage determinations much more easily, again, based on what NCCN says. Hence, in 2005, we started to develop the Drugs Biologics Compendium, and on January 16th, 2008, my good friend Lee Newcomer at United Healthcare, they came out with a press release. It says we will basically pay for drugs at the end based on the NCCN Compendium if they're category 1, 2A, or 2B, and that was that. In June of that year, Medicare recognized the NCCN Compendium, and then eventually all the private payers did as well.
How long did it take? I'm trying to remember, because you told me I ran into you at ASCO one year, and that was quite several years before, and we were trying to figure out what is the difference between the compendium and the guideline. Maybe we should recreate that.
Well, it was, I mean, the NCCN recommendations and the guidelines are just faithfully, accurately, and completely transitioned and transposed and translated into the compendium format. So I mean, that's why when you're anybody, but if you're submitting from a drug company perspective, you're submitting to the NCCN guidelines to get recommendations specified, and then those are just transitioned to the compendium format. So, but as you know, the compendium format was recognized legally, so we wanted to get that format and be recognized by Medicare. And so I spent about 2 years walking the halls of Congress, talking to some very smart people and some very young people. I was always amazed. You'd walk in and it was like, you'd have some very smart, at least book smart, 23-year-old sitting there, obviously just listening to you, because that was what he or she was required to do. So at least you think that you had a hearing in that congressperson's office. So, but anyway, we walked the halls, and eventually, certainly CMS knew that we were walking the halls. And as I say, at the same time, I was talking with private payers. And as you know, the good Dr. Newcomer was always extremely progressive, and he and I were talking. And so the NCCN Compendium became the basis for United Healthcare coverage.
And that was the beginning.
They were the first one, but as I say, six months later, Medicare came on board too, and then everybody piled on.
So how many I only know of one left, compendium.
Now there are 4 others, but NCCN is preeminent. There's because then there was this rush to be an NCCN compendium. So some of the commercial entities that had always just put out drug information did it. So I think there's AHFS DI, the hospital formulary people. But they've been around for years. And then there was micromedics, but then there were a couple new ones, one called clinical pharmacology, which was just a publication. And then there's another one that I can't pull. So there are now 5 Medicare recognized drug compendia. But again, NCCN is preeminent in terms of its influence.
What do you think is the percentage of use? There's probably no way to calculate there, or is it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the one thing that's interesting, and the good Dr. Carlson told me, I think it was, I don't know whether it was last year or 2019, I think it was 2020, but that NCCN had over 10 million downloads of its guidelines worldwide, which is just incredible. When I was there, I think we were right around 5 million. So it's double, but it just shows you, I mean, just the extent of utilization and application of NCCN guidelines. I don't know the exact, I mean, there's tremendous use of the drugs and biologics compendium by payers. I mean, I just know that for a fact, but I can't like quantify it for you.
So it's kind of a fascinating thing, because here's an organization that's set up for these 3 goals. One of these goals goes away. Another goal is met. A third goal is a little harder, showing that you do better than community practice, especially considering that your really number one user is community practice. So kind of like things change very interesting way, and this thing adapts to uses. And then the compendia situation, that really is a reformatting, literally reformatting.
Well, I think I was good at going with the flow, because I always say, you know, hey, look, I'm the lowest common denominator in the room here. So, but, you know, I do remember it was just a president-elect of ASCO said to me once, you know, we just had a board meeting at ASCO, and they said that move to make the guidelines of drug compendium was brilliant. And I just like looked at her and I said, well, I guess so. I never thought it was brilliant. I was just sitting there one day saying, this just makes eminent sense to do this, put it in a format that payers use. But I think that was key. And it was kind of always like trying to go with the flow and see strategically from an academic perspective, but also really from a business perspective, what was going to be best for the institutions as members, for the docs, and for the patients. Because as I say, we were in a situation, as you know, where that transition, I was part of it, to managed care, making the decisions in the 1990s was just not the right way to go. And we took it back from them, and it's still back. You know, I used to say, and I said it proudly, and actually it was Ira Klein at Aetna who called the NCCN guidelines A50, 50 lane highway. And I actually was flattered by that, in the sense that it showed that indeed that all appropriate options, you know, were being considered and recommended by NCCN experts, and that the payers then were making those options available generally, if you will, to docs in a shared decision-making process with patients. So I actually put it in a very positive light, because I thought it was important. And again, docs make decisions, they know the data, NCCN recommends, and basically, you know, it's available because the payers have decided they're going to use NCCN to make coverage policy.
Mm-hmm. But philosophically, also getting at this, like how medicine is practiced, just that move from a luminary to a very large number of people who can provide systematic quality care that provides very similar outcomes, right? That's
right. Well, I mean, as I say, it was important. And, you know, Rogerwynn was a wonderful gentleman. He was like a Renaissance man. You know, my wife has called me the least curious PhD in the world. And actually, she's correct. But the point being is, Roger was a Renaissance man, but I think his years in the, you know, in community practice, and just his wide variety of interests really brought him to the right place in terms of, you know, how to set up a guideline process that was really valuable, just in terms of clinical decision making. You know, the payer concept was more me, but you know, Roger, as I say, he's the father of NCCN guidelines. He was wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Well, but I think your wife might be incorrect in that.
I'll tell her you'll be in trouble.
I will be in trouble, but I think she might be wrong on this one, because you're maybe very focused on things, but you were clearly seeing opportunities, and
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
your head was not like this. You were like,
No. I had it in my head. I mean, the Aetna days were very formative for me in the sense that, I mean, I'll tell you, and you know it's in the book, but I'll tell you that. So at the end, one of the things they gave me, because I always would get these problem areas, because I actually did fairly well at Aetna. So at the end, they gave me this group, not the complete utilization management group, but this group of 7 doctors who would, have to make the final decisions because all denials had to be by an MD. And I got this group, and it was like this group of docs, not to be ageist, but who were like 61 to 79 years of old, who were like ENT docs and this kind of doc and that kind of doc. And they all thought that they had won the Nobel Prize or were close to it. And they were willing to make decisions in oncology and all sorts of fields they knew nothing about. And I just looked and I said, this is not the way. I do not want for a loved one or for myself, a doctor like this to have any influence on what's available to me or my family or my loved ones as patients. And so that really drove me at NCCN in terms of, we're gonna take back the night, so to speak, in terms of the docs are gonna have more and more influence. And I'm going to strategize and work with the board and with these great doctors to determine how we do that.
mm-hmm.
And we found our way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your book twice now. I wasn't going to mention it.
I'm promoting it to you. I'm sorry.
Well, no. I mean, since we're on record, we might as well talk about your book, because it's a very interesting. I've read the draft, I will confess.
Yeah.
Now I will disclose, rather. And I thought it was really fascinating to read it, and thank you for letting me see it. What are your plans with the book?
Oh, I don't know. For right now, as you know, it's sitting in abeyance. But I would just go back to it. It was formative for me because, as I talk about a lot of organizational policy groups, for me it was different than any other payer, even because for me, my group set what the policy was, across for the patient population, for the beneficiaries of Aetna. But at the same time, I, for some reason, as a poor PhD, ended up deciding case after case or case that was always on the edge. That was always on the edge and almost usually involved a patient who would die, and might die anyway, but who would die, but needed the opportunity in certain cases to have a certain type of therapy available to them. And as I've said to you before, it was exhausting and exhilarating. I woke up half of my nights in a cold sweat, literally. It's true, because I always had one of those cases on my mind, driving back and forth to work, at work, and as I slept. Mm-hmm. And so it also drove me at NCCN, because I said, the more we basically saw, the good experts, the KOLs who should decide what appropriate care was, gain leverage, establish the standard of care, and then gain leverage and influence with the payers, the more I wanted to make sure that was concrete and finalized.
Mm-hmm. I think your book is a fascinating historical document, which I think we should actually, if you give us the opportunity, the Cancer History Project would love to publish that. So
well, we should talk about that, because it's just sitting there and I haven't got time. And anyway.
Yeah, no, that's I wouldn't have brought it up, but you forced me to. If we were to look at NCCN and your experience there as a kind of a case study, what's there to be learned? What's the take home? You're now being a business professor more than somebody who made it happen.
I think the take home was, people to the day still tell me, gee, I was surprised they hired you from Aetna, and I didn't grow up in the cancer community. I did have like a medical background at AMA, but I think, I brought this perspective that was strategic in terms of, I don't know if I call it a business sense, because I don't consider myself a business person, but strategically in terms of, as I just kind of talked about, how decisions are made and how to insert an organization like NCCN into the nexus or the nucleus of decision-making specifically. And the other thing that I was lucky and fortunate is to have people like Bob Young. So Bob actually, what do you call it, was elected chairperson in 1997. So, you know, and he was chair for 4 years. No, that's a 3-year position. But what happened was Margaret Tempero was lined up. She was the vice chair to be the next chair. And then she ran and became president-elect of ASCO. So Bob had to hang on for another year. But, you know, Bob was right across the street almost at Fox Chase because our offices were in Philly. And so we would have go over and the two of us have these staccato conversations, you know, because like Bob's emphatic and I'm somewhat emphatic. But you know what? Bob would give me his direct opinion, but I kind of got to do what I, you know, thought was right with the oversight of the board. And when I got to NCCN, I think NCCN was in such a place that the board members in general were happy to have somebody, you know, who had ideas about where to take NCCN. And so generally they were quite supportive, and I wouldn't say I was totally free, but I had a lot of latitude, if you will, to kind of do what I thought was best for the organization.
What is there anything we forgot? Anything we missed? Anything you'd like to add?
No, well, the one thing I will add is like, because you know, I was anticipating, so what was the best thing about NCCN? It was the staff we assembled. You talk about a staff that was committed to improving, and you know, usually there's a lot of bullshit. Everybody says, well, you know, you look at all the, well, I won't go on, but you look at all the stuff on the websites. It was like, oh, you know, we're dedicated to patients and this and that. This staff truly was at NCCN and still is, you know, dedicated to bettering things for patients. And it was just a wonderful staff. And the one thing I will say about them, they had what I always call a sense of urgency. You know, if the NCCN panel met, they wanted those recommendations in the compendium as quickly as possible so that payers who were looking at the compendium would see them and then have to follow them. I mean, as I say, I just, and even at conferences, they were just so, what do you call it, customer oriented. We would always get great reviews of what they did at the conference. And I have one great story, if I can tell it the right way, but it was like, so in terms of registration for the conference, you know, we had this kind of room where stuff would come in the old days, faxes and things. And so this fax came in, the paper was blank, and the doc called up and said, I just want to make sure you just received my registration for the conference. And the woman, NCCN person, had retrieved the, what do you call it, the fax, and it was blank. He said, no, just fax it again. You know, what I just received is blank. And he faxes again, and it's blank again. And he calls up, and she says, no, I think we have a problem with our computer on our end. Just turn it over and see if that works. So she knew what he was doing wrong, but she put the blame on NCCN. That is the classic story about NCCN staff in terms of customer oriented and being, as I say, just wonderful with people and just dedicated. And as I say, having that sense of urgency that you need to make any group successful. And the other thing that we did and we were business oriented, that other not-for-profits really don't do, is we executed. And by that, I take that in the positive sense. We got things done. We didn't wait around. We didn't dilly-dally. As I say, I was fortunate with Bob Young and others, David Cohn, et cetera, to have their great support as chairs and just to kind of get things done, and it worked.
Well, it clearly did. That's what, 25 years? Yeah,
well, what was it? So 1990, it was started in 1995. So you're absolutely right, going on 26 years. So right. It was good stuff. And I was there for 15 of them, and it was a great time. And, you know, as I say, we got a lot done, and it was formative. Everything, you know, kind of leads. Aetna was informative for NCCN, and NCCN's obviously been quite important to what I'm doing in consulting, you know, and Aetna was important because we do a lot of work with payers, et cetera. So it's all good, and I'm still ticking.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with me.